Hi everybody. Here's what I figured out. This video is not only for my viewers on my YouTube channel, it's also for every person I ever meet in the future who wonders why I'm a complete lunatic at times. What I figured out through intense rumination, meditation, dissociation, investigation, has been unbelievably, earth-shatteringly shocking, and need I say very traumatic. When I first realized that my parents were lacking in empathy for my brother after he passed away from a heart attack at the young age of 44 years old, I didn't see what was coming. My first 6 months of going no contact and being in a state of trauma on my bed, hoping I was going to die. The conclusion I had come to was that my father's business, which had always been a failure, he had always been scammed. He had to go overseas to source seafood. He was in the seafood importation business from South America, primarily Central America. So he would travel there and he would source seafood, and often because of the nature of those countries, he would get ripped off. The product would not be what they promised. They wouldn't ship. It would not pass customs due to contamination of various sorts. It would be semi-thawed, not completely frozen, so a lot of it would get rejected. And that had been the story I had been experiencing my whole life. Of course, he had made money in between, but overall the business was not a success, and my parents inherited millions of dollars from my father's side. In the 80s, and so they had that money to live off, and I guess I always assumed my father's business had enough capital that he could always flip and, make a living, but he never provided for my brother and I past what he had to, really, at the age of, he never really did. He paid our living, we lived well. You may even say we had spoiled upbringings, but once we turned into men, 16, 17, 18, he kind of just disappeared and didn't really support us in what we did. My brother, may his soul rest in peace, was a stand-up comedian, and I'd been a programmer. Both of us had these careers for 25 years. My parents wanted my brother to be a doctor so he could take care of them in their old age. And they wanted me to work for my father so I can take care of the business in their old age. In other words, even when we were children, they basically laid out our life plan, and they never let it go. All through my career, they've been pressing me to work for my father, even though he has had less success than I have. I've been a programmer, and I've had some businesses and real estate. I've been around for long enough. I'm 47, and I started working when I was 17, so that's 30 years of going at it. So I thought they scapegoated me because my mother had asked me once if it was okay if she told some of her friends that the reason that my parents returned from Florida was because I was having some problems. And I figured, alright, no problem. She's going to tell a couple of her friends, they're in their 70s, whatever, it's never going to reach me. I don't really care. It'll cover her. And she was embarrassed, understandably, because my father got arrested for importing undersized lobsters. which is a violation of the International Lacey Act between the United States and many third world countries that cannot afford to enforce the environmental regulations of their laws. So they rely on the Americans to prosecute for international crimes, such as the one my father did, which was importing 2.9 tons of spiny lobsters, basically without taking out the babies. See, he wasn't replenishing the waters. You're allowed to fish out lobsters and other seafood, crayfish or whatever you want to call them, or even fish in general. You can fish out the adults, but there's always a size or a weight limit so that people don't come around and just take out the whole ecosystem. And my father violated that. So they lost a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars to legal fees. They lost their house, and they lost their citizenship in the United States and had to come back to Canada. So I remembered my mother asked me about that, and I really thought that was it. And it was horrible, because what my mother had done is she told me when I was working that she was going to give me an inheritance, because my brother had passed away, so that I could go on my own and start another business or start a consultancy. At the time I was working at a startup, an e-commerce startup. I was the head programmer, and it was a great place, and I told her I loved it, and that's when she made that offer to me, which now I realize makes her evil. I didn't take her offer up right away, but I did spend a year preparing for it. And when the year came up, I was exhausted because I was working full time. They were working me to the bone, 10 hours a day in the office. The commute was about 45 minutes there and back, so it was an hour and a half on the subway and the metro, the subway and the bus. And it just wasn't very pleasant overall, considering I was staying up all night to work on the project for when I took the inheritance, because I did not want to misappropriate that money and lose it. This seemed to be my last chance. I didn't have a brother anymore to rely on. I was all alone. So when I finally said, all right, Mom, I'm ready to take some of that money, I just needed, I think I asked her for 5 or 10,000, I can't remember, and she promised me 75. She said she wouldn't give it to me. She denied it to me. And that's what killed my brother. She denied him the money for money she had promised him to have fertility treatments. She was having trouble having a child, and my mother said she would pay for him, and then after 2 years of him trying, and he went to the money, she said she wouldn't pay because it didn't work, and he had a heart attack the next day and died. She did this to me 2 years later, 3 years later, with business. So at that point I went no contact. For the first 6 months I assumed, I told all my friends, and my breakdown when I tried to reach out to the family, and my whole, I couldn't conclude anything other than that was what they were blaming me for. Well, I was completely wrong. And this is hard to say because it's just absolutely insane. It takes my entire life and turns it upside down. And excuse me. This may not be as shocking for you as it is for me, but I still can't believe it. I haven't been able to program in a year and a half because I'd been, under the influence of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Although I've rebuilt my life in every way, and I feel great, and life's been great. From the day I went no contact, I was free, and I've been, my dopamine has been flowing like a river of love ever since. It's not like I've been having a lot of tough times. It's amazing. I'm living on barely any money, and life is fantastic, and I built up my apartment again from the ground up using stuff that I found outside. I live in an area with a lot of students, so when they move, they leave everything. I have 3 printers, 2 computers. I have a drone, I have a synthesizer. I have a beautiful leather couch. It weighs about 80 pounds. It weighs about 200 pounds. It's real heavy leather, like someone's grandmother. The place is beautiful. It's not very large, and it's not very expensive, and life is all right. But but it's taken me to get up here. I was living in the park a year and a half ago with nothing. I really had just one t-shirt on my back, and it was a slow build. And I knew all along I could not get a job. Working for corporations, as I had been for so long, it's just narcissistic abuse. Anyhow, here's the story. I'm going to start off in Eastern Germany because I trace this all way back. It's intergenerational. There is every element of narcissism that Sam Vaknin claimed that I did not believe applied to me, to my situation. We start off in Poland in 1938. And that is when two cousins got married and had their first child. These two cousins who got married did so to escape the Nazis. In order to escape, have the best chance of being allowed to move to Canada, they had to have a couple and they had to have a child. And so this very wealthy family, and this is my father's side, did what probably many people did and still do in the Middle East, is that first cousins get married and they're able to move a larger chunk of DNA or of family over. I imagine this causes enormous psychological problems in our society, and I think this may really be the source of what happened to myself and my brother. So they move here with their first child. That child is, of course, the golden child. That is my aunt, who was hooked up with a doctor, the lead heart surgeon at our local hospital, and she ended up, of course, being extremely wealthy, to the tunes of, multi-millionaire, an endless amount of money, and very narcissistic, with a family of successes, including a daughter who worked at the White House in the Clinton administration, and the other two children are both specialists in medicine as well. And that's my father's sister. So they move here with that daughter in order to arrive here, and they have another daughter. But they want to have a son, because in those days, and in our religion, to pass on the DNA is to pass it to the son. The mother has to be Jewish in order for the child to be considered fully Jewish. But the name, as we all know in North America, used to be only the husband's name, and since both of these cousins had the same last name, the idea of allowing it to fade away after all they had gone through was just not an option. So they were going to continue to have children until they had a boy. And lo and behold, the third child was a boy. And that boy was my father. And because he was so revered just by the fact that he was a male, and he can pass on the name, and just by the fact that I guess it allowed them to stop having children, because my grandmother at the time was already in her 40s. He was obviously extremely spoiled. At the same time, and my grandparents were extremely wealthy here in Canada. They bought real estate, and they were, by all means, 1%ers way back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So the son they had was my father, and as it turns out, his father, again, which is that man who came over from Germany with my grandmother, the cousin. Well, he wasn't straight. And in fact, neither was the woman. And that was the first shock that I had to I realized that's where it really began. It wasn't necessarily just to get rid of, just to save the two cousins, because what I remembered was that there were other cousins who died by the hands of the Nazis, and there were other cousins who made it out but came much later and remembered that some cousins were in Canada, and they came here, they followed the trail using the embassies, and they found family here, and they moved here, and that's how my family got established here. So I realized, well, why were they sent? And why were they sent with so much money? What was it? Why them? And then I realized by piecing things together with mostly what my mother had said, my father had said, and remembering, unrepressing many memories as a child, that they were chosen because not only were they Jewish, not only were they cousins, but they were also gay and lesbian. So to have all those strikes against them, they were definitely going to be the first ones to be slaughtered. So they were sent over. They had children because they had to. And my father was then born to a gay and a lesbian. And I remember my father telling my mother when I was a young boy that my grandfather used to go fishing every day to look at the kids, to watch the kids. Now, when my brother died the day before, he called me, and in his anger about my mother, denying him the $40,000 she had promised him, and now he was in extreme debt. And my brother was not like I was. He was extremely frugal. He was, I had always been in businesses in there, and I was self-employed, and I was employed at companies. If I want to make money, I know how to make money. So just like now, was never really too worried about it. There's always more out there. He was a stand-up comedian. He was a comic book collector. So everything he did had finite resources. So for that reason, he was much more frugal. And but by the same token, because he was married, he had some debts that I don't have any debts. And he to be $40,000 in debt all of a sudden by my mother, by no fault of his own, just by the fact that the fertility treatments didn't provide my mother with a grandchild, was too much for him to handle. But before he passed away, he called me screaming about her and yelling, and I said, Stu, I know, they're crazy. I always knew that. And he was saying, no, you don't understand. And I didn't know what he was saying at the time. But somehow during that conversation, he brought my comments about how my father would abuse me and my mother would abuse him. He brought it to the point that my father was somehow getting off on the abuse when I was younger. And when I first went no contact and hit the traumatic state, I came to the conclusion that my father was molesting my brother. Otherwise, how would he know? Because I don't remember that. All I remember was pushing my father away and never liking my father and never bonding with my father. My brother bonded with my father, and he seemed to get along with him better, and he gave him a lot more credit than I did. I always thought my father was a complete loser. He was cruel, he was mean. Now I know, what he was. He was a psychopath, so, that's what he was. When he wanted to be a good guy and a nice guy, he could be. But the emotional content was lacking, and he made comments to me that he never felt. He doesn't understand empathy. And I can see from his history, he's had business partners and people around him, but they never last. They last a month, 2 months, maybe 6 months, but he's gone through probably 100, 150, 200 people that should have been his partners or his employees or his friends, and all his friends he ripped off, didn't pay them for services rendered, whether they were lawyers or, it was even his lawyer who called me and warned me about my own father. That's for other videos. So I first thought, okay, my brother was molested by my father, and I realized, okay, he used to try to take me alone, but I didn't remember until really recently that my father did try molesting me. I remember two instances very, very, vividly now. One, I guess I was about 3 years old, and he took me to the racket club where he plays racquetball, which he always did, and which was always suspicious to me because he would leave at night the house and he would say to my mother he was going to take a shower at the racket club. And as I got into my teenage years, I used to hear that or think about that and think, what kind of a man leaves his wife to take a shower with a bunch of men? I guess I realized that because in high school, I didn't like taking showers in school with other dudes. I mean, I don't really want to see a bunch of wieners hanging in my face. It's not something I look forward to, or rather, I prefer not to. I'll wait that half hour and get home and take a shower, myself, or if I had a girlfriend, forget it. It's just ridiculous. But so it's always suspicious. But I always assumed my father was in a closet, maybe, or he just didn't know what he was. I never really thought about it too seriously, until recently. So they come from Germany. They have a child. They come from Poland. These two lesbian and gay cousins. I've already got multiple strikes against me, by the way, right? Not only is it incest, which could produce some kind of brain damage. 3 strikes. Not only is my grandmother already in her 40s, which apparently can cause forms of autism, various cognitive defects in the offspring, but I also have the fact that they're gay and lesbian. So it's cousins. It's an older mother. It's gays and lesbians, and it's during time of war, which I couldn't help. Man, and I don't think that probably helped things either. So it's a miracle that even my father was born, and he ended up diving into the water at age 8 years old, and he hit his head, smacked it open on a rock up north. And I've come to the conclusion that was when he lost his mind, or that's when he became a psychopath. His relatives were definitely always narcissistic, but he definitely seemed to be lacking something dead between the eyes. And when he would try to get into the music my brother and I liked, or he would talk about things other than sports, it's like he was trying too hard. He tried to empathize. He tried to, bond with us, at least myself, but there was nothing he could because he couldn't feel anything, really. So, I didn't know this, of course, at the time. I'm just telling you the truth as it is. I'll explain this over the next many hundreds of videos as I think I'm back in order. So my father hits his head, and he becomes a psychopath. Shortly thereafter, he takes one of his little cousins, or a neighbor in the neighborhood, up into an electrical box. He used to have these boxes with all the electrical wires that the companies would. They probably still have them, but they're probably or no, I think right now all those electrical boxes are centralized. But still, you see people going up and repairing. Well, they used to be enclosed. I don't think they are anymore. And you're able, I guess, to go in, especially if you're a young child. And my brother, God forbid, my father brought a younger boy in there and attacked him, raped him, molested him, whatever you want to call it. Perhaps he was doing it more often than just this one time. But he was caught, and his father, my grandfather, apparently beat the hell out of him. And apparently it was the only time that my grandfather ever beat my father up. And now maybe that, whatever it was, the combination of diving into the rocks and then the beating, my father, I imagine, was never to be the same again, either psychologically or neurobiologically. He had brain damage, he'd been traumatized, and his sexuality was just budding. He was an 8-year-old boy. Coming from a father who was a pedophile himself, I imagine my father had been molested as well. father, of course, does not suffer any consequences because he's part of a very wealthy family. And my father was extremely masculine. You would never think for a second that he had any tendencies at all. I still can't believe it. I mean, up until 2 years ago, I thought my father was completely straight. And I mean, when I say completely straight, I just mean I thought he was a straight guy. I always thought he had a weird sexuality. I actually thought he wasn't very horny, really. That's what I thought. Because, like I said, he would leave the wife, take a shower out, and I never saw them really getting it on. And now when I really thought about it, I realized I never saw them even kissing. A couple of hugs here and there when I was young, maybe, but I never realized that. I never realized that my mother never really was very affectionate towards me. Almost all the affection I got was from my father and my brother especially. I say my brother because I didn't mind my brother's affection. My father's I always was very, very hesitant to accept. And I never knew why until recently now when I remembered that when they tried to molest me at age 3 years old, when he took me to the racket club. But I will say this, that when it didn't work, he gave up. So, he had me alone there with his friends, and they were trying to get me to touch them, and they were tricking me in certain ways. But when it didn't work, I remember my father going, well, I guess it's not going to work. So, look, if it happened to him, and it worked on him, I guess he may have thought that it was going to work on me. Why it didn't, I don't know. At the end of the day, I love women to this very day. I tried it with guys when I was in my young 20s, and, it made me want to vomit, and it's just not me. I love women so much. So do my brother, so it goes to show you to some degree it must be. Well, let me just go on with my story. So my father doesn't suffer at all. He has all the money in the world. He's driving sports cars, and he's being treated like gold. But of course, there's this problem. My father is gay, and my father is openly gay. That was my first big shock when I realized, my God, he's not just not horny or in the closet or unsure. He is completely out of the closet. My father is a real gay man. And I realized this because my friend told me when I was 22, and I repressed it. He said, Neil, I saw your father at Crisco's last night. And I said to him, it's impossible. My father's out of town on business. And he said, Neil, no, I'm telling you, bro, I saw your father there. And Crisco's was the first club here in the city that was a gay crowd mixed with a straight crowd. And it was because it was the beginning of the rave scene, which was, at least as far as I understand, when gays and lesbians became mainstream, and when straight people became more open to acting gay, just when they were happy. So I started to hang out with a lot of gay clubs. I'd bring my girlfriends. It was great. I could trust the guys there. I know most of them were not going to try to pick her up. And, those were the great music and the great DJs. And I still go to mostly the gay clubs. So, okay. My father's gay. He goes to this gay strip club. Or his brother, or somehow he meets a stripper, a female stripper, because this establishment, it's the first strip club I went to, there used to be males on one floor and females on the other. By the time I was old enough, it was just girls, just women. When I say old enough, it was 14 years old. That's when we started to go to strip clubs. When I realized my mother was working there. My mother was not from a wealthy family. She never pretended to me to be, but she never told me she was from a poor family. She did. She told me she was a poor child. They grew up poor. And she told me that her father was very poor, my grandfather. But it was only recently that I realized, wait a second, she moved out of her house when she was about 22 or 25. She grew up poor. Well, what does that mean? If she was poor until she was 12, it means she was developed. You know, her mind, her psychology, or psychopathy was developed in abject poverty. When she would wake up, she'd tell me she'd open the lights and there would be millions of cockroaches. And the sound of those cockroaches, just horrified her. So she's a stripper because she brought up poor. She wants to be wealthy like all the other Jewish girls whose parents came from overseas. My parents were, my mother's side was from Montreal. They were Russians, but they'd been here one generation longer. And as you know, as the generations are in this country longer, it seems the poorer they get. They come over with all the money, just like the Chinese do now, but then their kids spend it. So by the time it got to my mother, she didn't have money. She became a stripper. She was, of course, that's when I believe her false self was born. And she had a big nose. And I imagine that big nose and the poverty combined to make her into a psychopath. And the fact that she had a coma at age 13. And when she came out of that coma, she found out that she had a little sister who was born, obviously, just in case my mother died. Which was why my mother was born, because my mother had an older sister who died. My mother was born named after that older sister. So you add those three criteria together, those three variables, I imagine my mother was damaged. And my father, you can see also how he was damaged. Although he was on one side very revered as being a man, the boy who can carry on the name on the other side, he was a homosexual who had no interest in doing so. What happens is my grandmother tells my father, you don't get married, you're not getting any inheritance. Now my grandparents were wealthy beyond their means. My father was a psychopathic homosexual party animal. His only employment up to the time that my parents got married was working for my grandparents, collecting rent for them at the apartments they owned. And then he was in sales. My father never did anything intellectual or even physical with his hands. He never did anything artistic. It was just talking. Going to collect rent until marriage, and then selling insurance, and then selling seafood. Completely the opposite of myself, my brother, my mother even, and everyone on my mother's side. All very intellectual, very interested in fine-grained detail of life. Alright, you know what's coming. The stripper, the poor Jewish stripper with the big nose, is recognized as a Jew by some guy who's bisexual. That's my uncle, who's going upstairs and downstairs, upstairs and downstairs. This uncle sees or meets my father, finds out he's Jewish. Oh, sorry, my uncle knows that my mother's upstairs. It's his sister. So when he meets my father, anyways, he hooks them up, brings them to the rabbi. Again, second generation, lesbian woman, gay man. That's my parents. I had no idea. I think my brother knew. I think a lot of people in my family knew. I'm sure a lot of them know. A lot of them know who knew may have passed on. And I think the big reason they were keeping it from me was, first of all, because of my brother's molestation. Second of all, because they were afraid I'd remember my molestation attempts, what my father did to me. I mean, he assaulted me in my sleep. And they concocted a whole story. My father was never going overseas on business. It was all a lie. So there was no business failures to cover. The business failures were covering for my father's pedophilia, which never ended, and to this day has not ended. As far as I know now, my father is living with a kid who was homeless. He met him on this, the guy was a squeegee kid. He was basically cleaning my father's windshield, and my father picked him up, and he's now living with him right across my mother in the hallway. That way, whenever family comes over, my father just hops over and nobody knows. This has been going on, ladies and gentlemen, their entire lives. When I think about growing up now, everything they said to me, every piece of advice, every time they threw someone out of my house or got angry at me or bought me something or were nice to me, it could all be traced down to control and manipulation to cover who and what they were. And primarily, when my mother made the deal, she knew she was marrying a gay man. She was bisexual as far as I know. I've come to put things together. She was, as a teenager, she had the big nose. She probably was not that attractive in retrospect. Her personality was probably cruel and evil and a bitch, and she often projected the word witch onto other people. So I imagine with her big nose, she may have internalized Carl Jung's archetype of witch. And of course, as a teenager, people are not going to accept that, especially if you've got a big nose. So she may have been teased as well. Anyhow, but she did not know she was marrying a pedophile, and she did not know she was marrying a psychopath. My mother is a narcissist. She is much more intelligent than my father. My parents, my father's grandparents may have come from Eastern Europe, wealthy, but as we know, psychopathic families get wealthy. Doesn't mean they're intelligent. Doesn't mean they're intellectual. It doesn't mean they understand. It just means they know how to control and manipulate other people. They may be masters of controlling people, but they're not masters of controlling nature. My mother's family, on the other hand, much more organic, came from poverty, lived in poverty, and just were more political, just more involved. So my mother, I remember her screaming that, "Oh my God, here this goes again." So my father was basically caught molesting my brother. At that point, my father started to take me to play hockey, which was abuse for me. I hated it. I wasn't never an athlete. And until about 6 months ago, so that's 46 years, or no, he started taking me when I was about 6 or 7 or 8, around there, 7 years old. So we'll say for 40 years, I hated him for that. I said, "Why did you take me?" I was enjoying my weekends. We used to draw. I was artistic. I would play the organ. I used to have a organ. My grandfather on my mother's side. Anyways, but you know what? To this day, I realize. Now I realize. Thank God he took me, because I think what happened was my brother was then in grade 5 when we start sex education, and he probably came to the teacher and told her my father had been touching him or raping him, or God knows what the poor guy went through. And they kept it hush. It was a Jewish school, a Jewish family. Again, my father gets a pass because of who he is, because of what he was born into. And they probably said, "You better take your younger son." First of all, my father couldn't see my brother. I remember them not being together for a few years. My brother would leave every weekend and go to my aunt's. And my aunt was the only one who ever took us to amusement parks with her husband. My parents never took us anywhere. And now I realize why. It's because they couldn't. My father had court restrictions. He couldn't be with us. So instead of, basically, it's crazy. My mother couldn't divorce him because she wanted the money. And my father's mother made the deal that we had to make it till 18 years old. And that's why I felt like I had a loving, caring family. And my brother probably too, because I didn't know anything about this homosexuality. I didn't know anything about this pedophilia. All I knew is that if I wanted something, with enough prodding, I was able to get it. We had more than enough food. My mother seemed to be all over me when I was growing up, really caring how I turned out. And now I realize she cared how I turned out, right? She just wanted to make sure I made it until she got the inheritance. And my grandmother died. She was the second of, that was the one who really mattered. She was the controlling lesbian, right? And then she married her cousin who was a pedophile, a gay pedophile who molested my father. So he wasn't doing much but looking for kids on the property, probably molested many, like my father, I imagine, has more than enough victims. When she finally got the inheritance, my mother, and that's when I was 16 and a half, 17, that's when the abuse started really heavy. She threw my band out. We used to I had a band for about 2 years in the basement, and we were getting really good, and we were going to start playing gigs, and we were becoming 18, we could start going to bars, and they came downstairs and threw us out with no good explanation. I brought a girl over, my first girlfriend, threw her out, told me that if I didn't break up with her, I wouldn't get my inheritance. Now, whether that was because they just wanted me out of their life and they wanted me to make me miserable, or because my father couldn't have other kids under 18 in the house, I'm not sure. My father had been arrested after that first time. He didn't get arrested with my brother, but he had video arcades from the age of when I was about 11 till about 14. And it was a great business, and he closed all 4 of them after a long criminal case about a big sign, an oversized sign. He had the third arcade he bought, the sign was about 8 feet high, and they brought him to court. It was covering other people's windows, and eventually that caused him too much expenses and trouble, and he closed all the arcades basically overnight one day. And that was, of course, a big lie. My father was caught with his partner, with a boy, or maybe more than one boy, in the back of the arcade, and the courts told them, you've got to close your business because it attracts kids. So my father, for the second time, made my mother's life miserable and impoverished us at that point even greater. He was on probation or parole for that crime, fighting it, again pretending to be out of town. They told me he was trying to start a plant in Mexico, a plant meaning a manufacturing for seafood. I now looked up where that city was, and it wasn't even near any water, so it wasn't happening. It has no seafood business. It is the capital of our consulate, and as I've recently discovered just this past week, he had a boyfriend, basically, who worked at the Mexican consulate. So when my father got arrested for the arcades, and he had to stay away from the family, his friend, the Mexican consulate, made sure he was able to live in Mexico for those few years and just come back to Montreal once in a while to keep the story going and to show up for court. And that was really it. My father had an apartment downtown that I did not know about, and this is why my parents, who I now found out from his lawyer, inherited a lot more than $2 or $3 million. This is in the 70s. They inherited, tens of millions of dollars, and they treated my brother and I like they were basically, they were okay. Like I said, they bought everything, but they never helped us in business or really did anything beyond, saving our souls if we were really, really in trouble, because it would look bad on them. I took advantage of that over the years, not even realizing consciously that I was, but it seemed like my mother would screw me over, and then when I would demand money to make her up, she would come up with it. And I went through a few cycles of that, and now I realized that they were taking advantage of me and screwing me up on purpose, because they told everybody that I've ever known since I've been a child that the reason why my father's not around is because I was having psychological problems to some people, or to some other people I was in business with my father and we were out of town together. So for all these years that I've been in computers, my mother has been pressuring me to go into business with my father and sabotaging my successes as much as she could in order for me to cover for my father's pedophilia and for my mother's lesbianism. And why didn't my mother leave my father when she finally got the money? Why did they move to Florida and live together in a house even though they were not married and they were both dating other people? And I think my mother went back to prostitution. Well, for that very reason, my mother was a cocaine addict. And this I know for sure because we found cocaine in the house once and they tried to blame it on my uncle. No. Because my father was pouring it out in front of me. He was very angry, but my mother was hiding. Why weren't they both teaching us the lesson? Because my uncle brought it from my mother. My mother used to have a gold fingernail. One, the pinky. Because that's what she used to do as a stripper. So I thought I was brought up by an upper middle class, very conservative, non-sexual, cold but close-knit, hot-blooded kind of a family, if that makes any sense. I say cold because it was run by a psychopath, and I think my mother's, probably a sociopath. For her to do what she did to my brother and I. And my mother also killed her sister because my mother was 14 years older than my aunt, her sister, who died of anorexia. And my mother used to cook for her, and she used to add butter and all kinds of fattening agents to the food in order to fatten up her little sister so that my mother would look beautiful. Because her little sister, who my aunt, may her soul rest in peace, was not born with a big nose. And by the way, when my mother got the inheritance, the first thing she did was get a nose job. She didn't leave my father, even though he was caught raping my brother and molesting kids, and because my mother is a sociopath who just wants to be lazy, be a prostitute every now and then, and spend all her money on cocaine. And for that, she threw her life away. My father did not ask to be molested by his father. He didn't ask to be gay or pedophile. And as I think back to him, even though he exhibited all the psychopathic traits and confessed to not having empathy and not even understanding why anyone would feel bad for anybody they hurt if it wasn't them, he was a prototypical psychopath in that after he was done with us, he left us alone. And my mother even mentioned many times that she would try to project it onto other men. She said men don't care about their offspring. They would just leave them and never look back. Which is essentially what my father did. Understandably so, he was attracted to males younger than his own sons. So, I can understand where it would be so bizarre. And the few times that I would see him maybe twice a year over the last 20 years when I wasn't living in their city. They moved to Florida, he was in prison. I was living in a different city with my brother. Maybe I saw them twice, 3 times a year. A few times I wouldn't see him for 5 years. And the first thing he would comment is something physical, like a little goatee or something that I would get very upset because I go, this is my father. And that's the kind of frivolous stuff he notices on me. Like, I was having business success, or I was getting a new girlfriend, and he'd get all excited about it. It didn't make sense to me because my father was never flamboyant, but never in a feminine way, and he never dressed very well, so the whole thing was just I never understood it until now. he was basically kept in the closet by my mother, because my mother, although she was into women, she's also into men. And primarily, as she's told me over the years, she doesn't know what she is. And you and I both know, and Sam Batkin knows, that's a narcissist. She just wants attention. She didn't get it when she was young. And when she got her nose job, she ended up looking, beautiful. And she dyed her hair, and she tanned her skin like Donald Trump every day with orange cream. So, she looked glamorous, and she'd be attracted. Younger men would be attracted to her. And that's her narcissistic supply. My mother is primarily a somatic narcissist. My father is an absolute psychopath. And I wanted to say that I didn't tell you this. My father really is a psychopath, because one of the traits is revoked parole or probationary conditions. And I didn't finish saying it, but when he lost his arcade for molesting a boy or more boys in the arcade, and then he was using that Mexico front to pretend he was out of town when he was really in town, and my friend saw him at the gay club. Well, he did something again, and his parole was revoked, and my mother lost $250,000 at that time because they put up money for him. So he must have done something for him. He probably raped a boy with that kind of money. I don't think it's just a molestation. It could have been he was in Mexico and he killed a boy, for that money. Someone said that sounds crazy. I don't know if he was in Mexico or if he was in this city at the time, because he was supposedly always in Mexico. Perhaps he was never in Mexico, but the fact that his boyfriend was a Mexican consulate worker, I imagine that was his life. And that's why, even though they inherited millions of dollars, they never treated us too well, because they were affording two lifestyles. They had 2 different homes, 2 different rents, 2 different utilities. My father had a hidden car I never knew about. It was basically the same old insanity that I got the primary shock from my ex-girlfriend psychopath, that complete double life. No sexual indiscretion, or no sexual discretion in terms of societal norms. One a prostitute and one a homosexual pedophile. Were responsible for my aunt's death and my brother's death, and this close to my own. I mean, 2 years ago at this time, or a year and a half ago, when I was living in the park for a few weeks, I mean, I was as close to as dead as you can imagine. I had just experienced 6 months of disassociation. I had abused my body by consuming so much amphetamines, because my brother died of a heart attack, and I had been using amphetamines for ADHD, and I wanted to die, and I figured, well, what's the best way if my brother died of a heart attack is just take a lot of amphetamines. And it just proves that my brother likely died of a broken heart, because I've taken so many. I've gone on, I had some of those, what do they call them, binges, where I didn't sleep for 6 or 7 days, and I could feel my heart almost wanting to die, but it never did. And my brother never did any hard drugs or anything. He never, and he just died from, I think he died because he knew the secret he had kept from me for so long, and he probably knew how my parents were abusing me, forcing me into my father's business through tricks. And when he knew that my mother had done the same to him over something even more severe, well, I don't know if you can say it's more severe than someone's entire career and relationships, but my brother realized, my God, now she did it to me, over $40,000, and she abandoned me in my time of need, and I realized I can't have a child, and I have this trauma, because he was very depressed over it. Although he was resigned to adopting, he couldn't handle it. He would have had to tell me the truth. He would have had to go no contact with my parents or have it out with them. All the molestation memories were probably flooding back that night. And he'd just gone through 2 years of stress, and he died, And really the miracle, I mean, there are many miracles, which I'll tell you in other videos, because this is just, I mean, I'm telling you just 2% of what I know now. You know, I'm just telling you the real, I mean, the shocking truth. Shocking to me, you know, and anyone who knew me growing up and who knew my parents, it'll make sense to them. You know, I asked my friend, who I hadn't spoken to for a long time, but he contacted me when I first had the breakdown. He heard I was having trouble, and he says, Neil, I just remember your mother always sitting in the sun when we'd come home from work. And now I realize why. It's because she was working as a stripper, and she had to keep her tan. So she would, you know, and why she did all this is the sick part. You see, she didn't do all this because she wanted to have a family. She did it because she was promised, you know, $1 million, $500,000. I don't know the amount, but she did tell me that she got $500,000 inheritance from her father. But now I know her father was poor. And she used to always say how my grandmother, which is my father's mother, who made the deal, she would always say, oh, your grandmother, she used to drive a hard deal. She was a real butch. She would drive a hard deal. I never really understood what she was talking about, but now I know what it was. She wouldn't give my mother the money until I turned 18. My mother would often repeat, you know, we didn't have to do anything for you after the age of 18. You know, you're our son only until 18, then you're an adult. And she would say this after a childhood and teenage years of being all over us. You know, you'll do what we say, and you'll follow our rules, and we know what's good for you, and we'll always be there for you. And then all of a sudden, to make that switch, well, not only did I not really notice it happen because it was so sudden, and also I was a teenager and, you know, more interested in girls and parties and music than I was my parents' you know, interactions with me or what they were going through. I mean, really in retrospect, I was completely self-involved on one end, not to have noticed, or I was just too young not to have noticed, because, or it's just so bizarre, right? I never thought of it until this year. Even I went through 1 year of trauma thinking about it, and I didn't even reach the conclusion until I reached some evidence, and, you know, I put it together. It's not been easy. I'll explain how I put it together, but look, that's my story. I was born to a gay and a lesbian couple who were paid to have children. I never really had a mother and a father. You know, I always knew I didn't have a father. It seemed like I had a mother, but I guess, I don't know, I mean, I guess if you're a woman and you're a lesbian, you have 2 boys. Well, look, maybe that's why my brother and I came out straight. I mean, who knows? Because we certainly, you know, we both had our share of girlfriends, and we loved women's bodies so much. I miss him for that. We'd see, you know, anyways. Look, I just want to tell everyone the story because I've been living with this on my shoulders for about 6 months. I went 1.5 years of investigating. I told my parents, I didn't tell them I left an angry voicemail, or I contacted them 1 or 2 times or 3 times, just one way. I sent 1 email, and I never looked for their response, telling them what I know. And I sent 2 voicemails on the phone, hung up, never heard them talk to me, expressing my anger and telling them how stupid they were for not coming out and telling me, and basically keeping the family as honest as it could, and just expressing disgust. You know, I'm not disgusted that my father's a pedophile. I mean, I'm horrified. And he definitely molested me as a child. He didn't molest me, he assaulted me as a child multiple times, and he gave me nightmares. I used to have nightmares of a bear in my room, and I would wake up under my covers, and I would be terrified to look out of the covers and see the bear, and I would sit there and actually, you know, urinate as a little boy instead of like going out of the covers to look. And of course, after probably was minutes, but seemed like hours. I would look and there'd be no one there. But now I realize I'm sure it's because my father used to come in while I was sleeping, because I do remember one time he came in when I was sleeping, and he did something to me disgusting, which I'm sure you can figure out if you think about it, for about 2 minutes, and you're a man. And my mother found him doing it. It woke me up. I went right back to bed. As a little boy, of course, you're tired. But my mother caught him. I remember her screaming, "Oh my God!" I mean, she, you know, in the end of the day, I don't even know if my mother really, I mean, maybe she wouldn't have been narcissistic. I think she was borderline. Like I am, because I'm crazy, by the way. I'll tell you about borderline in other videos, but I think when she found out she was a borderline, until she found, no, she was a narcissist. The strippers are not borderlines. Well, maybe, but when she found out my father was a pedophile, and she had to cover that, that's when I think her mask really became firm, thicker, and just more dishonest. I mean, I don't understand why she didn't take the money and divorce him. She was lazy, right? She was lazy. She was, what do they call it? Parasitical lifestyle. My father's money was keeping her going. They never lived a great lifestyle for all the millions their inheritance, because she was a cocaine addict and he was addicted to little boys. And anyways, look. It took me a long time to get here, folks. I don't know if there's other guys or girls or women, men out there who are going through a similar thing with their parents, realizing their parents were sabotaging their businesses and relationships, coming to accept that their parents did not mean the best for them. Well, I hope none of you make the conclusion, or come to the conclusion, or make the discoveries I made, because I've been through multiple stages of trauma, and I still have a lot of research I want to do. I'll tell you how I found it out, by the way. A lot of it was unrepressing memories by thinking all the time, since I wasn't working, and just focusing on remembering, putting together parts of my life, and then remembering things when I would wake up, going, "Oh yeah, I remember this line," and certain conversations I would have, and a lot of it was records on the internet. I would never be, okay, first of all, my brother calling me before he died and telling me that my father was molesting him was key. The fact that that was the only thing he told me, more or less, in terms of information, was key. He must have known subconsciously he was going to die, and he had to pass the information on. Otherwise, I never would have known. I never would have had a clue. I'd repressed that. And people used to ask me in my childhood, and I would tell them I don't remember anything before my first joint at 14. And I guess that was just a way of me, like, almost like a psychopath, saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter to me, right? I'm too strong for that," or "Ha ha ha, life is great, and I'm having a great time, and it's all about good times." Killed my brother, destroyed my life. I mean, I could have had, I don't know if it destroyed my life or it created who I am. It did both. It destroyed my life. All my girlfriends, fiance I had. I mean, my parents just made sure everything was not going to happen. And I guess after a while I kind of accepted it. And now that I'm 47 years old, I don't have a wife, I don't have kids, I don't have a brother, I have no family. I feel like my life is completely full of potential. And even if nothing materializes, every day is like magic for me. I don't have to worry about anybody or anything. And on some level, I'm wondering, maybe that's what my parents wanted from me, because maybe they knew that that's what they wanted. I would love to have a family and kids, but I do believe that had I done it earlier, I may have ended up like many of my parents, and many of you probably, in relationships with psychopaths and narcissists, and now divorced and tied to them. I managed to avoid that because I'll tell you now, I dated a psychopath who was a mafioso. And that's how I discovered all this about my parents. She was the real catalyst. But even before her, I dated many strippers and just girls who basically were my mother, and I didn't even know. I never knew why. But with that story out, hopefully I can get back to my channel and talking to you about what I've discovered and the research I've done on psychopathy. And mostly the research I've done is on on what people don't talk about. Well, I've done the research on what people don't talk about because what people talk about on the internet has been done very well. When I first heard Sam Vaknin and the Spartan Life Coach and Narcissist Free talk about things, I just didn't think it related to my situation, especially the part about pedophilia and incest that Sam talked about. But sure enough, and I'll tell you something, when I was first day I met my ex-girlfriend, who ended up being a sexual psychopathic mafioso biker. I know she's everything that you can imagine. And I mentioned my father, and I mentioned the sex business somehow, or the arcade. I can't remember what I mentioned. It wasn't about my father being a sexual predator. I didn't know at the time. I thought he was just an asshole. When I talked to my father, she asked me if he was a psychopath. So she recognized it, and I didn't. I didn't even know what she meant at the time. I was just like, yeah, he's a crazy guy. And that's probably why she knew she could take advantage of me, is that I didn't respond to the word psychopath. Well, that's about everything. I can tell you that it left me with extreme case of borderline personality disorder. I spent the first year researching psychopathy, and actually spent the first year and a half spending researching narcissism and psychopathy. It seemed like 6 months of narcissism, a year of psychopathy. But since then, I've been looking into my own self. I mean, I had to in order to get back to this point, because it seemed like I was stuck in a loop. And I still am to some degree, and have been forever. And it really is a borderline. I have a lot of traits that are narcissistic, psychopathic, or antisocial, I should say, and histrionic. But I'm none of those three. I'm borderline. I seem to cycle between feeling great about myself, which could look like narcissism, or egomania in a way, and then I'll cycle into like anger over something silly like a psychopath, and lash out, and then I realize it was just stupid, and I'll become goofy like a histrionic, looking for attention just to be fun. And then maybe I'll get that attention and I'll start to feel good about myself. But really what it comes down to is instability. I'm not a narcissist. I'm not a psychopath. I'm not a histrionic. I'm a borderline. And it's hard to get a hold of. I met a girl, and as soon as we got close, I started to lose myself, and I pulled back. I was like, oh, I can't do it. I'm really good. I rarely act out with people who are not intimates, but when it comes to girlfriends, it's really rocky. You can see now. I mean, you can see why. Now I understand why. My model is so abnormal that it's a miracle that I'm even alive. I mean, look, my parents were trying to kill me. I'll tell you something. Before my brother died, my parents had me sign something and they were hiding what it was. And I think it may have been a life insurance policy. I think that's maybe why when my brother died, they didn't cry. I mean, they seemed to be more in shock. I think they were planning on murder, having me killed by my father's boyfriend, that homeless kid. Because my parents don't have money, and they inherited millions, and they went out of work, and they're older, and my brother died. Anyways, look, that's the whole story. I'm going to stop it here. I've recorded this video probably 50 times. So I hope this one